Hello everyone and welcome back to Circus and Circuit, Unraveling Global Trade podcast. I'm Kate Foronda and I decided to devote today's episode to one of the most strategic resources in the world. And it's not oil, not lithium, not data, it's water. Here's a simple reference point that surprises many people. In the United States, a gallon of bottled water can easily cost more than a gallon of gasoline. Bottled water often sells for $2, $3, sometimes even $4 per gallon. Gas prices move up and down, but very often they are in the same range or even lower. But in spite of this, in global trade, water is treated as if it cost almost nothing. This is not because water is abundant or easy to replace. It's because most of its real costs are hidden. Tap water is cheap at the source, but the systems that make water usable, transportable, and reliable are not. When those systems are stressed, the true cost of water suddenly appears through shortage, delays, and trade turbulence. Every ton of wheat, every cup of coffee, every cotton shirt, every semiconductor chip, and every unit of electricity produced by a power plant depends on water. Still, in most trade models, water is either dramatically underpriced or not priced at all. It's assumed to be always available and stable. However, that assumption is no longer right. For decades, water was treated as a local issue, only like a public utility, something that governments handled in the background while businesses focused on markets and profits. Today, that way of thinking is breaking down. According to the Global Bank, more than 2 billion people already live in countries experiencing high water stress. By 2030, global demand for water is expected to exceed sustainable supply by around 40%. This is not some abstract warning, it's a structural constraint that is already affecting agriculture, energy production, and industrial planning. We have seen this play out very clearly in recent years. For example, in 2023 and 2024, prolonged dryness forced the Panama Canal to reduce the number of ships that could pass through each day. Less fresh water meant less transits means delays, higher shipping costs, and rerouted trade flows between Asia, United States, Europe. One of the world's most important trade corridors was interrupted by not conflict or sanctions, but simply by lack of water. Water shortage have also changed food trade. For example, after weak monsoons and dropping reservoir levels, India restricted rice exports to protect domestic supply. Those decisions pushed global rice prices higher and affected food importing countries across Africa and the Middle East. And once again, water conditions shaped trade outcomes long before end consumers can feel the impact. Another example, the digital economy. Digital economy depend on water. Large data centers that power cloud computing and artificial intelligence consume enormous amounts of water for cooling. In parts of the United States and Europe, local communities have begun pushing back against new data center projects because of water use. And in some regions, access to water is now a deciding factor in whether an advanced industrial project can move forward at all. This is why in this episode, I would like to talk about water not just as an environmental slogan. I would like to talk about water as trade reality. How water is already being traded indirectly through food, energy, and manufactured goods. How countries export water without even shipping a single drop. Why future trade disruption may be driven not by tariffs or sanctions, but by access to fresh water itself. So this is a story of blue gold. When people hear the phrase water trade, they often imagine pipelines, tankers, or bottles of water crossing borders. In reality, that is not how most water moves around the world. Most water is traded without anyone ever seeing it. This is where the idea of blue gold comes in. Water is called blue gold not because it's sold like oil, which we called black gold, but because it has become both essential and scarce. Just like oil once defined trade, power, and geopolitics, water is starting to do the same. The difference is that water usually does not move on its own, it moves through products. Economists call this idea virtual water. It's another new term for you. Virtual water is not water itself, but the water used to produce something. When a country exports wheat, it is also exporting the water used to grow that wheat. When it exports beef, it is exporting the water needed to grow animal feed, raise livestock, and process meat. When it exports cotton clothing, it's exporting the water required for irrigation, processing, and dyeing. Once you understand virtual water, the meaning of blue water becomes very, very clear. Countries are trading water without calling it water. They are exporting and importing water security through food, textile, industrial goods, and this changes how we should think about global trade in general. Water is not evenly distributed across the planet, we all know that. Some regions have steady rainfalls, large rivers, and renewable aquifers. Others depend on seasonal rains, melting snowpack, or groundwater that is already being overused. According to UN Water, approximately 20% of global freshwater use is linked to good produced for export. This means a significant share of the world's water consumption is driven by international trade decisions, not by local drinking or sanitation needs. And this is also explains why water problems do not stay local for long. Water shortage does not only reduce harvest in one country, it reduces export, restricting global supply, raises prices, and affects consumers thousands of miles away. For example, cotton is a clear example here. Cotton production is highly water intensive, especially in dry regions. In growing cotton in water scarce areas for export puts heavily pressure on rivers and aquifers. The economic benefits of trade often travel abroad while the environmental costs stay local. Over time, this creates long-term stress for farming communities and ecosystems. Another example, meat production. Meat production shows the same pattern on even larger scale. Beef has one of the highest water footprints of any food product. Producing 1 kilogram of beef can require more than 15,000 liters of water once feed, grazing, and processing are included. Countries that export beef are also exporting water-intensive land and feed systems. As water becomes more limited, this model becomes harder to sustain. What makes virtual water trade especially risky is pricing. Water is seldom priced in a way that reflects scarcity, long-term reduction, or environmental damage. And as a result, water risk often remains invisible in trade contracts and investment decisions. A deal can look profitable on paper, but the real cost is absorbed by ecosystems, governments, and future generations. Once we understand that water moves through trade invisibly and that water determines players on a global stage, which means who can produce, who can export, who can compete, the next question is, where does this invisible water trade matter the most? And the answer is agriculture. Food production is where water scarcity stops being abstract and becomes impossible to ignore. Agriculture uses most fresh water than any other sector, accounting for roughly 70% of global fresh water withdrawals. This means that when water becomes limited, food systems feels the pressure first, and global trade feels it sooner after. Recent research highlights how serious this shift has become. In 2023, assessment by Food and Agriculture Organization found that more than half of the world's irrigated cropland is already under high or very high water stress. This is critical because irrigated land produces around 40% of global food output, despite covering a much smaller share of farmland. In other words, a large part of world's food supply depends on water systems that are already close to their limits. Another important finding comes from a 2024 study by the World Resources Institute. Researchers found that countries facing extreme water stress are also among the fastest growing food importers. This is such countries as Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Egypt, Singapore. This creates a structural feedback loop. Water-limited countries become more dependent on the global market, and at the same time water-rich, exporting regions like United States, Canada, France, Argentina face increasing pressure to produce more, often at the expense of their own long-term water security. Those pressures affect trade policy. Governments are becoming more willing to limit or restrict food exports when water conditions deteriorate. These decisions are often explained as a food security measure, but the underlying driver is water. When water becomes scarce, exporting food turns into a political and social risks. For importing countries, these create a new kind of instability. Food prices become more sensitive to rainfall patterns, droughts, and water conditions in distinct regions. A weak rainy season or dropping groundwater levels in one country can ripple through global market within months. What appears to be a price shock is often a water constraint moving through the trade system. At a farm level, long-term changes are also underway. In water-stressed regions, farmers are being forced to rethink what they grow and how they grow it. Water-intensive crops become harder to justify, and some producers switching to less thirsty crops. Some common switches rice to wheat, for example, cotton to oilseeds, alfalfa, which is high-protein forage crop, to barley, sugarcane to corn, and there's more examples. These shifts reduce export capacity gradually and change trade pattern over time, not just overnight. The key point here is continuity. And this means that in long run, these forces accumulate and make global food trade less predictable and more fragile. Once water scarcity begins to limit food production, the pressure does not stop there. It moves next into industry and energy. 2023 analysis by the International Energy Agency showed that energy production already accounts for about 10% of global freshwater withdrawals, and that share is expected to grow as electricity demand rises. As countries electrify transport, expand renewables, and build more data infrastructure, competition for water between energy, cities, and agriculture is intensifying. One of the clearest examples is thermal power generation. Coal, gas, nuclear plants, they all heavily rely on water for cooling. During heat waves or prolonged dryness, water temperatures rise or river levels fall, and this forces power plants to reduce output or shut down temporarily. This has already happened in part of Europe, in the United States, and Asia. What looks like an energy reliability issue is often a water constraint. Digital economy. It adds another layer, we already discussed it, but data centers require constant cooling to operate safely. A single large data center can consume millions of gallons of water per day. And as AI expands, so does it require more and more water. Mining is another pressure point. Many of the minerals for energy transition, including lithium, copper, nickel, are extracted in water-scarce region. Lithium production, in particular, often relies on groundwater evaporation in dry areas. 2024 research review is highlighted that water competition between mining operations and local communities is becoming one of the biggest barriers to new mining projects, even where global demand is strong. One example is Chile, and I think we talked about it in previous episodes. Another example, hydrogen production. It shows the same tension. Green hydrogen requires large volumes of clean water for electrolysis. While hydrogen is promoted as a clean energy solution, its water requirements are often overlooked. In water-stressed regions, hydrogen projects face the same question as agriculture and industry. Where will the water comes from? So what ties all of these sectors together? Its location. Industrial and energy investments increasingly depend on water availability, not just on labor, capital, or regulations. Regions with stable water systems gain an advantage. Regions with water stress face limits regardless of their economic ambitions. And as water scarcity begins to limit agriculture, industry, and energy, attention shifts to one critical question: who controls water and how? Around the world, governments and companies are investing heavily in water infrastructure. This includes dams, reservoirs, pipelines, treatment facilities, and desalination plants. These systems are no longer seen only as public utilities. They are becoming strategic assets. According to the World Bank, global investment needs for water infrastructure run into the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The companies design, build, operate, and finance water systems. And there's a relatively small groups of global firms on the market. Companies like Veolia, Suez, IDE Technologies, key players here. So when you hear all these discussions about water scarcity, a natural question come up: how can water be scarce if it covers about 75% of the Earth's surface? That part is true, but most of that water is salt water, not fresh water. Salt water cannot be used for drinking or for most food production without expensive treatment. When we talk about water scarcity, we are not talking about all water. We are talking specifically about fresh water, the small share that people, agriculture, and industry actually depend on. One of the fastest growing responses to water scarcity is desalination. Countries like Middle East have been pioneers in this area. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel now produce a large share of their drinking water from seawater. Saudi Arabia alone is one of the world's largest producers of desalinated water, and it operates dozens of large-scale plants along its coast. Desalination changes the water equation, but it does not eliminate scarcity. It's energy intensive, expensive to build, and costly to maintain. It also creates environmental challenges, including brine disposal and higher emissions when powered by fossil fuels, for example. In effect, desalination allows countries with capital and energy access to buy water security, while others cannot. At the same time, water management is shifting toward public-private partnerships and, in some cases, privatizations. Large multinational companies now operate water treatments and distribution systems in many cities around the world. Companies like Veolia and others provide expertise, financing, and technology where governments lack capacity. Supporters argue that private involvement improves efficiency and investments. Critics warn that it can raise prices and reduce access for vulnerable population. Of course, this raises difficult ethical questions. Water is essential for life, and many international frameworks recognize access to clean water as a basic human right. At the same time, water systems require massive investment, maintenance, management. Someone has to pay for that. When water is treated only as a public good, it's often underpriced and overused. When it's treated only as a commodity, access can become unequal. So, balancing these two realities is one of the hardest challenges that policymakers face today. Now, when we step back and look at a full picture, one thing becomes clear. Water is not longer just a background condition for global trade. It's one of its defining limits. Water determines what can be grown, what can be manufactured, where energy can be produced, and where industries can expand. It influences food prices, investment decisions, supply chain reliability, and political stability. And yet it still sits outside most trade models, risk assessments, and strategic decisions. This is what makes water different from other strategic resources. Oil, gas, minerals are openly priced, traded, and negotiated. Water usually is not. Its value shows up later through shortage, disruption, and crisis. So, how our future looks like violins of blue gold for global trade. This creates a shift that is slow but irreversible. Trade flows will adjust to water availability. Agriculture export will face greater limits. Industrial and energy projects will increasingly depend on water access. Infrastructure and water management will become part of national competencies. For companies, ignoring water risk is no longer an option. As we just talked, water scarcity can affect operations just as effectively as sanctions or supply chain shocks. Businesses that understand their water footprint, their exposure, and their long-term access will be better prepared for decades ahead. For governments, the challenge is even greater. Water policy is not only about utilities or the environment. It's about trade, security, and economic stability. Decisions about water allocation, infrastructure, better water management, and pricing will shape future in ways that today I still underestimate. The most important lesson is this. Water scarcity rarely announced itself with a single dramatic event. It works silently through more restrictions, higher cost, and more fragile supply chains. And over time, it reconstructs the system. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Kate Foronda, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay tuned.